Now we are moving to Great Britain, and I am proud to announce Nicolás Bueno de Mesquita. He recently defended his PhD at Cortland Institute, and now he's an independent scholar in Great Britain.
Okay, well, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks very much, Ivan, for this invitation and this impeccable organization. And thanks to all of you. Thanks to the interpreters who are doing such a great job. I think you can all hear me.
Yes, perfect.
You can see my slide. Through the second half of the 19th century, many Western European writers and artists and musicians and other members of the cultural elite nurtured a vision of Russia as a vast ancient rural land whose people constituted a reservoir of primal qualities and a potentially transformative cultural force. So Nietzsche, writing at the end of the 1880s, summarized this, said, "The mark of the next 100 years, the entry of the Russians into culture, a grandiose goal, the approach of barbarism, the awakening of the arts, the magnanimity of youth, and a fantastic madness and real strength of will." That was, of course, only one view from the west of Russia, but versions of that particular representation were embraced, at least for a short period, by Bruno Taut and Adolf Behner and Theo van Doesburg. And I'm going to talk about that period immediately following the revolution. And at the end, I will finish by considering briefly what light this little episode casts on our view of the internationalism that we normally associate with the European architectural modernist movement. I should say that in this, I'm just looking in this paper at the westward view of a certain number of people involved in the architectural world. These kind of views were highly asymmetrical, and if one started to look at the Russian view towards the West, then of course we would get a completely different pattern of reactions. During the summer of 1918, Bruno Taut takes a train to Kaunas in Lithuania, a country that was until 1915 a part of the Russian Empire. Taut clearly saw Kaunas as a surrogate for Russia. He wrote, "It's on the threshold of Mother Russia, on the edge of that great Russian culture." And he contrasted his experience of Kaunas to East Prussia, only 2 hours away on the train. In East Prussia, he says, everything's so orderly, but dry and sober. Here it's quite different. In what he clearly saw as almost Russian towns, Taut celebrates the triumph of a quality of direct expression combined with an unruly disrespect for stylistic rules. He writes, "A church with red brick tower with trees around. Is it Baroque? It's so unusual, quite another Baroque, so child-loving in its proportions, curious and original in structure. Where the base, the cornice begins, it's naively built as children would build it. You want to fondle it." And then about the traders' shops in the town, he writes that the signs outside the traders' shops, he says, always painted in pretty colors, prettily painted, naive, childlike, folk art, full of expression. Henri Rousseau might have painted them. But Taut also takes pleasure in some of the more recently built apartment blocks in the city, which show a similar disrespect for any rules. A theme running through his description is that all this reflects pure enjoyment of life and of the moment experienced by the Slav builders and craftsmen. This produces work which trained architects and Western Europeans, field grey he calls them, educated in the conventions of style, find difficult to understand and dismiss as kitsch. But for Taut, it's the culture of the field grey Europeans which is at fault. Adolf Behner had not given any significant attention to Russia until in early 1918 he wrote of the revolution. he wrote, "In Russia, conscience has wakened. In Russia, the folk has awakened. They are the same. Never in history has so magnificently been shown the moral strength of what the folk is capable. It is a heroic cultural act." He published a series of 4 articles in mid-1918 about the art and architecture of, as he would put it, the Russian folk. These articles appeared ostensibly as a review, not of Viollet-le-Duc, but of a book by a man called Alexander Eliasberg on Russian art. Eliasberg had served as a corrective to Viollet-le-Duc's À la Russe, which had projected Russia as a land whose culture had been dominated by foreign invaders or influences, in particular from Byzantine sources. Bueno, drawing on Eliasberg, focuses enthusiastically on pre-Petrine church architecture and opens his analysis with a rapturous discussion of examples from this period. But he talks of other aspects of Russian art. He's seen an exhibition of works by Russian prisoners of war held during 1918, and talks about the fantasy of forms of carved figures and scenes. He talks of Kandinsky and Kandinsky's ethnographical expedition to the Vologda region. He finds support in Tolstoy's late treatise, What is Art?, which embraced the art of the people and rejected art associated exclusively with the higher social classes. Bueno quotes the novelist's account of a choir of peasant women, creating a feeling of joy, cheerfulness, and energy. Bueno concludes by attacking contemporary neglect of this pre-Petrine architecture in favor of the princely art. So he attacks the preference for the princely art of the Renaissance and the neglect of the pre-Petrine architecture of Russia, but suggests now that this art of the folk is poised to overthrow the Renaissance canon. Sorry, I seem to have sorry, I've stopped because I seem to be hearing the Russian translation of my paper, but there's perhaps nothing I can do about that. It's all right, I'll just carry on. So he writes, so long as history is represented as it has been now by the taste of the ruling classes, the creations of the individualistic high Renaissance will constitute the canon, and silent wonders of earlier will remain in the shade. Bueno suggests that the exemplary design of pre-Petrine church architecture is applicable in the contemporary world. He praises it using the terminology he'd use a few years later in his major reflection on contemporary architecture, the modern functional building of 1926. He notes that church interiors are functional in relation to the ceremonial to which they're dedicated, and he uses the word sachlich, which he would continue to use to denote the practical, buildable, and matter of fact. The exteriors, with their upward momentum towards heaven, offers to the observer an unambiguous sign of the meaning of the building. In June 1918, a few weeks before the publication of Bono's 4 articles, Theo van Doesburg wrote to his friend Anthony Koch, "I am now working on a monumental dance, Russian dance." The work seems to have been of particular importance to van Doesburg. At 1.36 meters high and 0.62 meters wide, it's one of the largest he ever completed. And there are as many as 13 preliminary sketches for the composition that have survived. Doesburg was familiar with Russian artists working in the West, and particularly with Kandinsky's writing. but the impulsion to this new project was certainly the revolution. In another letter to Koch of early 1919, he would embrace Lenin and the violent proletarian revolution. So this is a quote from his letter. He says, "I agree thoroughly with this great man from the East again. The old state machine must first be radically broken to create a new and improved one. I consider it utopian to think that peace can come from parliamentary solutions." And so on. I won't read the whole of the quote. His figure in Danse Russe, and we can look now also, sorry, I've gone too far. So those are the preparatory studies. Those are 7 of the preparatory studies that are made for Danse Russe. The figure of the dancer clearly makes a reference to the Russian folk. The preliminary sketches show a dancer in loose costume with thighs and arms lifted parallel to the ground and hands raised. Pose probably came from contemporary representations of traditional Cossack dances in the West, often labeled Russian or Ukrainian. Troops of Cossack dancers had visited Paris during the Russophilia of the 1890s and accompanied the Russian participation in the Exposition Universelle of 1899. And Degas had also portrayed this characteristic leaping action. Van Doesburg started Danse Russe at a time when he felt favorable views of the revolution, and it seems reasonable to associate the vigorous action portrayed with this violent revolution. The sketches and final painting convey a crude energy in the Cossack dance. In the sketches, Van Doesburg used clashing diagonals and figures in precarious poses. In the painting, the open structure sets up flowing movements. So what we see in the sketches and the painting is a kind of progression from the relatively naturalistic representation of the dancer through a stage where the subject is still recognizable, though simplified, and finally to a stage where pure forms are redistributed and traces of the original representation are lost. For Van Doesburg, this progression has several meanings. It's observable here as the artist's working method. It also has a historical aspect, a vision, Van Doesburg's vision of the current and future evolution of the arts. And it also has a moral aspect, in that less spiritual and particular nationalistic motivations were largely associated with the first, most representational phase, but are largely eliminated in subsequent phases. If Van Doesburg himself is demonstrating and performing this transformation in Danse Russe, his choice of subject matter suggests his confidence that the Russian Revolution will also tread this path. His subsequent enthusiastic support for the work of Lisitsky and of Malevich and other Russian suprematists suggests that he would have felt his expectations had been met. These ideas articulated in the period immediately after the revolution would evolve in the following years, but will continue to reverberate powerfully. The displays of the works of Malevich and Lisitsky at the 1922 exhibition of Russian art at the Van Diemen Gallery in Berlin were important determinants in the subsequent directions taken by modernist German architects. Some of the reviewers of the exhibition use expressions such as Asian or barbarian again to evoke the spiritual, to relate the spiritual inheritance of Russian art to these new works. They suggest that this enabled Russian artists to strip away the accretions of civilization and to return to the simple and the essential. Paul Westheim describes the radical simplification represented by Malevich's white on white, suggesting it is the culmination of the progressive abandonment of the representation of objects and then color. And he goes on, those barbarians in the East have in mind the possibility, indeed the necessity, of giving art a new archaic period. they see it as their mission to set about their work afresh, empty-handed, to begin with basic concepts, and thus conceivably to achieve something which may be different in principle from anything done before. And other critics wrote in similar terms of the 1922 Van Diemen exhibition. L. Lisitsky's 1922 lecture, New Russian Art, introduces recent developments in Russian art and architecture to a Western European audience. Lisitsky makes short work of the kind of thinking that we have been talking about. He opens the lecture by launching a vigorous attack on the kind of perception of Russia we've been discussing. He exclaims that the West, quote, has discovered the art of the Negro, the Mexican, the Javanese. He hurries on to emphasize that, quote, Russia is not Africa, Mexico, or Java. We and Western Europe are living in the same age and not far distant from one another. Lisitsky would go on to attempt a fundamental resetting of the tone of cultural exchange between the Soviet Union and the West. The basis of this would be his belief that the arts throughout the industrial world were developing along parallel lines. From this, he argued that artists and architects from disparate countries needed to engage in the exchange of ideas because they faced common tasks. These ideas would receive widespread support from leading figures in international modernism, including Moise Ginsburg in his 1923 Style and Epoch, and Walter Gropius in his book, International Architecture, published in 1925. So this more symmetrical vision introduced by Lisitsky became what we might call the official doctrine on international exchange practiced within architectural modernism. But it is well to remember that to some extent, the launching of architectural modernism had its roots in an earlier, very different model of international exchange. Thanks.